I've been on the water my whole life. When a place that should feel safe, when the sound of waves and the smell of diesel and fried bait starts to feel wrong, you notice. And I can tell you, without embellishment, there are nights I still hear the echo of 3 particular mistakes. 3 small decisions that turned routine outings into scenes I replay whenever the tide comes in. These are true stories. I was there for each one. They involve an island that shouldn't have had anyone on it at night, a man at a marina whose presence smelled like something you couldn't name, and a yacht with an orange distress flag that, for a few heartbeats, smelled of coffee and human life and then evaporated like steam. If you like true scary stories, hit like and subscribe. I've got more. But if you stick around, I'll tell you everything I remember, exactly as I remember it, including what I still can't explain. The first one starts with a summer night and a place that felt smaller in daylight than it did once the sun went down. We called the place the island, because for a long time there was no reason to give it anything else. It sat a short run from the mainland, just a cluster of scrub and a flat pitch of sand, where people would haul their boats and cook, leave coolers and temporary trash, laugh until the tide dragged their laughter away. It was the kind of island people treated like a back porch, a place you could park a boat, light a fire and disappear for the evening. By day it was postcard sweet. Low dunes, a few scraggly oaks, and a long stretch of sand that caught sunlight in a way that made everything look forgiving. There were markers carved into driftwood, names of people who had come and gone scrawled in permanent Sharpie. We swam off the rocks, jumped from the makeshift ladder Trevor had lashed together, and raced each other back to the boats with wet mouths and salt-caked eyelashes. What stood out even then was an absence. The island was almost unnaturally quiet of small life. No high-pitched chorus of frogs greeting the dusk, no owls calling. The crickets were thin. In the daytime you'd notice it if you were paying attention, the beaches littered with shells and cigarette butts, and yet very little evidence of nesting birds, no tangled nests in low branches, few footprints besides ours. We joked about it. Teenagers joke about anything. Cursed, someone said once when a frisbee blew into some reeds and never came out. We laughed and made a new game out of daring each other to leave a mark somewhere the island's quiet couldn't erase. We grew up thinking we owned that small stretch of land the way kids think they own an arcade machine. It's easier to call an island yours when it's been the backdrop for every messy rite of passage. First beers, first fights, first makeouts that felt like being dropped into a movie. So when Trevor suggested we do something dumb and grown up, camp overnight there, I agreed before I'd thought it through. We were an unashamedly incompetent band of 20-somethings who understood boats better than boundaries. Trevor owned the boat. He had a name for everything on board, like they were part of a family. Cushions, the motor, the dinghy. Rosie was his girlfriend then, steady and practical, the kind of person who could set up a tarp with one hand and hold a beer with the other. Megan was the reason I said yes. She was quiet in a way that made you strain to hear her. She smiled like the rest of the world was a secret she was keeping. I liked her from the start. Awkward, fidgety, the kind of crush that existed mostly in the space between "wouldn't it be nice" and "what would I even say?" I think the entire reason we considered the night romantic was because it gave us an excuse to be together and call it nature. We packed light. Cooler with sodas and a little beer, sleeping bags that smelled faintly of backyard smoke, a Coleman lantern that had seen better summers, and a flashlight I kept glued to my hip like a talisman, the cheap beam that never really shone more than a soft halo. The ride out to the island is always a pact with the horizon. That thin ribbon of water takes your noise and your light and promises to give it back the next morning. We tied up on the lee side where the sand made a small natural harbor. The first night was what you expect. Fire, music low enough to talk over, silhouettes moving in the circle of light. Someone told a story about a shark. Rosie smoked and rolled her eyes. Trevor cooked some kind of questionable foil-packed dinner, and the smell of it made the gulls keep their distance, or maybe the gulls had long since stopped making the island theirs. Night has a way of changing proportions. Trees turn from friendly shadow into high-backed judges. The beam of a flashlight narrows everything and sharpens the edges where your imagination meets the physical world. After a while, the easy chatter dwindled. Megan drifted farther from the group, sitting close enough to me that our shoulders would touch, and not quite close enough to make it a thing. We passed the lantern between us until the fire took over, and everyone leaned inward to share warmth. I noticed a peculiar silence first, as an unease that could be pinned to a single thing. No insects in the brush, no rustle of small mammals, no wayward wings. That lack of ambient life creates a vacuum. Sound travels farther then, in a way that makes footsteps and voices feel like they belong to the island itself. You start filling the quiet with your own worries. Maybe that's why we didn't hear anything until Megan did. She stopped mid-sentence, looked at me and then toward the tree line with that small furrowing she did when she was trying to calibrate her senses. "Do you hear that?" she asked, so soft I almost missed it. I told her she was imagining it. "Wind," I said. "Branches." It was easier to say something than to admit I had a small icy prickle along my spine that didn't have a name. She wasn't having it. "No," she said. "It's like voices. 2 of them. Quiet." That should have been it. We should have laughed it off and poured more beer, but there are moments that don't let themselves be laughed away. The group's attention, subconsciously ceremonious, shifted. Trevor, who liked to be the one in charge of disruptions, squinted toward the trees in a way that indicated he was thinking about throwing someone else's joke back at them. Then we heard it, a soft repeat of a syllable, almost like someone practicing a name. The noise came from the dark line where the trees met the sand. It wasn't words exactly. It was more like a cadence, the kind of half sound you make when you test a voice in your head against a possibility you don't want to accept. Megan's lip trembled. Rosie paled slightly. For the first time, Trevor's posture went alert in a way that made me want to climb back into the boat and push off. We had one flashlight, which I held like a nervous animal. I swept it slowly across the tree line, the beam slicing the night into a circle of brightness, and then nothing. For a second, there was only the black of leaves and the silver of moon against bark. The beam caught 2 silhouettes among the trunks, standing like sticks themselves, 2 narrow people who might have been children or adults. The distance made it hard to judge. They didn't move. They were nothing remarkable in shape, but watching them was like catching a pulse in the stillness. The hair on my arms went straight up. 2, Megan whispered. We all tried to blink normal. The world seems to take back whatever it can. Someone laughed nervously. I panned the flashlight back, and when it hit where the figures had been, they were gone. Not hidden by a bend or ducked behind a log. Gone as if someone had closed a curtain the instant the light hit them. The beach had a clean line of sand and then trees, and where those shapes had been there was only a ragged patch of shadows and a scattering of leaves. No one spoke for a long beat. Then from the tree line there was a voice, female, close enough to be clear, and calling softly, coaxingly, "Trevor, Trevor, come back." It wasn't a yell. It didn't want to be heard by everyone. It sounded like someone reading a script they had practiced. The combination of the 2 vanished figures and that low, personal call broke something in the group. Trevor blinked as if someone had flicked a switch in his head. He took 2 steps toward the trees, like someone who had decided to do something brave, and then opted for the less brave option. "I don't like this," Rosie said. She stood. Her voice had edged into a hard, practical tone. "We should go." Megan grabbed my sleeve like some silent reassurance. My mouth tasted like pennies. Trevor shook his head, as if he was dismissing the sound, and not himself. He stood, and the voice called again, softer still, as if the caller were right behind a veil. "Trevor, don't go." That was it. The pleading doubled down on tree-line privacy, and the world shrank to the small circle of our fire. No one wanted to be the one to break the moment. It would have been different if we'd been rational adults. Maybe then someone would have radioed the Coast Guard, or roused everyone and gone in the daylight. But we weren't thinking in daylight terms. We were thinking in impulses. Protect the group, protect each other. Don't be the person who goes alone. I grabbed Trevor's arm. My hand found the warm, sure weight of him, and I pulled. "Let's get out," I said, voice low. "Now." For a second he argued, half-formed, about proving something or just checking. I didn't let him. We shoved people toward the boats like shepherds shoeing cattle. The trip back to the mainland was a blur of diesel fumes and a silence so complete The radio's static sounded like a judgment. Someone cursed under their breath, some of it nerves, some of it embarrassed laughter masking fear. We tied up, slept in our beds like people who had been somewhere else and come home bruised by the night. By morning the island felt smaller and a little bit meaner. The tide had rearranged the sand and the footprints we had left were softened and smudged. We joked at breakfast, but the jokes were small, brittle. I told myself I had misswept the flashlight, that the figures had been tree trunks, a trick of shadow, that the voice had been some drunk person calling for their friend at the breakfast tables 2 beaches over. But we went back. There was something childish about it, a mix of guilt and curiosity that felt impossible to ignore. You don't go back to every place you have a problem with, but we went back because the alternative was living with the what if. We wanted to see if the island would give us an explanation, or at least the comfort of an answer. Wind, a prank, an animal. The beach looked the same in broad daylight. Closer up, everything was wrong in a way that didn't have a rational footing. There, leaning against a twisted oak a little off the main camp, was a stick figure roughly the shape of a person. Someone had shoved thin branches together and lashed them with twine into the crude suggestion of arms and legs. The crude head was a knot of seaweed. It wasn't new litter. The figure was propped carefully, as if placed. It hadn't been there the night before. There was no way it could have been, because we had staked out the fire ring and the driftwood, and every obvious islet where someone could hide. The idea that we had simply missed it felt like denial. We didn't find footprints leading away. There were no signs of a camp. The whole thing smelled faintly of salt and leaves, like everything else on the island, but when I caught scent of it, I felt an unmistakable cold, like someone had opened a freezer. It was a childish thing in construction and yet not a child's handiwork. The twine was old. The branches had been stripped of bark in a way that looked deliberate. Someone said, "It's probably a prank," trying the rational line again. Someone else, me probably, stared at the figure and felt a stomach-lurching certainty that some rule had been broken. That border between what belonged on an island and what didn't had been crossed. We didn't stay. We took pictures we never posted. We told other people and watched their faces go blank as they tried to convince themselves of an ordinary explanation. I stopped going out to that island after that. It wasn't a dramatic decision, but it was firm. Something about being on a piece of land with an effigy against a tree changes the way you move there. You begin to anticipate sounds that don't come. You imagine shapes where there are none. That island taught me something I didn't want to learn. Isolation can host people who don't identify with the rules you think govern a place. A place can be quiet and still contain something deliberate and human in its oddness. I still think about Megan, how she heard the voices first, how tangible that terror was in her small frame. And I wonder what we would have done differently if any of us had been less small-town brave and more willing to call for help. We let ourselves be human that night, and then punished ourselves for it later. Guilt comes in strange flavors. Regret that you didn't stay and investigate further. Regret that you didn't trust your instincts and leave earlier. The softer, more corrosive guilt that asks whether your decision to flee condemned someone else to some unknown hazard. You make lists about alternatives in your head, as if that would buy you absolution. It doesn't. If the island left a lesson on the table, it's this. Being near water gives you a sense of proximity. People come and go, and you often assume absence equals safety. But absence can be deliberate. Silence can cover intentions. After we stopped going to that island, I took to spending more time at the marinas, a place where you can see people and keep track of them. It made me feel safer in a mechanical way. There are more faces at dawn. There are the clanks and creaks, and the banal business of engines being tended to. But marinas have their own kind of wrongness, which brings me to the second story, and to a man named Buddy. You learn the rhythm of a marina, like you learn the habits of a town. People come in predictable patterns. Weekday commuter boats that slide in, slip into the same berth, the same cigarette-stubbed ashtray left on the rail, weekend yachts that smell of lemon oil and vinyl. There are rules, explicit and unspoken. One of those rules is that if someone needs a transit slip, you help them if you can. That transit slip is a temporary berth, basically permission to tie up and do what you have to. Refuel, grab a bite, fix a line. We had grown up offering shelter to strangers more than we should have, sometimes in the spirit of neighborliness, sometimes because it made for stories. Buddy arrived in the kind of way you only notice after he's left. He was an old man in a boat that had the same relationship to seaworthiness as an antique has to functionality, more sentimental than practical. He was abrupt and a little bit rude. People at the docks called him Buddy because it was the only name he ever gave. He had a thermos with his name stamped on it, Buddy, like some stubborn label to the world. He quarried space with a genuine unpleasantness bordering on indifferent. He barked at kids to stay off his stern. He told jokes that did not land. He had a face that looked like it had been folded and kept folded until the skin tired of being smooth. The first odd thing about Buddy wasn't his rudeness. It was an odor. He moved through the marina and everything around him seemed to catch it, the way a candle flames when you hold it near a breeze. At first I wrote it off as old age, or a boat that hadn't been aired in too long. Old netting, diesel, damp canvas. But it wasn't that. It was a complicated, cloying scent that sits somewhere between rot and chemical, like wet laundry left in a car in summer, or a soup you can't place the recipe of. The kind of smell that sticks to the lungs and makes you want to cough and scrub your hands. He arrived one afternoon and paid for a transit slip with a card that smelled like worry. He pulled up, tied off, and then, as dusk crept in, settled into a methodical presence. He kept to his boat mostly. He came to the dock now and then to bark at someone or to huff a cigarette with a long, practiced patience. People noticed but generally treat off-putting folks like weather. You mention it, note a forecast, then go about your day. Night settled with the usual marina soundtrack, distant engines, the thrum of refrigeration units, a sullen gull complaining over a fish. I had been back on the water longer than I let on, and the routine calmed me. I went to bed that night with a slight itch. At around 3 in the morning, something cut through sleep like a fingernail across glass. It was a sound that made your bones go first. Soft, controlled, not a shout but a series of muffled noises, like someone rolling over cloth or someone trying to keep their voice low while saying the worst possible thing. It was the kind of sound that asks questions of you, because it seems like we're the only witnesses willing to listen. I was awake, heart ratcheting. The dock light painted the walkway in ovals. From my bunk on the flybridge I could see the silhouette of Buddy's boat, a dark chunk in the ink. I climbed down, not because rational thought demanded it, but because some primitive muscle in me knows the measure of sounds. The noises were irregular, a short sound like trying to gnaw air, then a whisper of a voice, this time sharper, an adult's voice, held down. "Shut up," it sounded like in a tone that made my stomach go hollow. I froze at the edge of the dock, trying to pass distance and origin, but the marina does its best to confuse perception at night. Every echo complicates the truth. The sound didn't belong in a normal place. It felt out of time, like someone replicating scenes from a person they'd seen once and never forgot. I considered going down to his boat. I considered waking someone else. Those are two different impulses, one anchored in investigation, the other in safety. For every situation where doing nothing is immoral, there are 10 situations where investigating alone makes you the victim. You pick your balance of courage and prudence in a fraction of a second. I crept closer anyway, because I am the kind of person who hates the idea of unanswered sounds. As I reached the dock ladder, the light through Buddy's small porthole glowed. Shadows moved. I thought I saw a flash of someone at the window, a silhouette pressed against glass like a character in a photograph that had been exposed too long. Buddy, older, solid, stood in a doorway, looking out. There was something about the way he kept himself steady that made me think he already knew. He met my eye through the seam of glass for a second and gave a little nod, a movement that was equal parts acknowledgement and dismissal. He left at first light the next morning, fast as someone who knows they don't belong anymore. He motored out like a man who has no intention of returning. He didn't stutter with excuses or wave goodbye. The transit slip went empty. I went over after to snag the empty berth, and in the light the smell was still there, but it translated differently. Tar and something else under it, and my sense of the smell's offensiveness turned into a nagging, moral weight, like being near something you can smell and not knowing whether to report it. We never found any sign on his boat that someone had been kept there. No ropes, no torn blankets, nothing in the way you'd conceive it from the muffled noise in the night. I tried to tell myself that I had imagined the whole thing, that the mind loves to supply horrors at 3 in the morning. I went home and made coffee bitter enough to punish me for the trouble of staying awake, and told myself the marina had taught me nothing more than a lesson in misperception. The thing is, I couldn't shake the image of that porthole shadow. And every time I tried to convince myself it was nothing, the memory tightened like an old sweater until I couldn't breathe around it. Guilt did the rest. If someone had been on that boat and needed help, was my decision to not push harder a moral failing? At what point does a private fear become culpable? I lay awake listing what I could have done, called someone, banged on the hull, demanded an explanation, and then folded the list into a small, useless paper boat. These 2 nights taught me different kinds of lessons about the water. The island taught me the peculiar terror of something deliberately out of place. The marina taught me how small acts of indifference can stack until they feel like a weight you carry home. Both taught me that when people are quiet, they can still mean terrible things. Both taught me that sometimes the most important decisions are the ones you can't prove either way. I started carrying a small camera after that, an old compact that wasn't much, but it had a flash. Partly it was to prove things to myself, to have an objective artifact to hold when memory curled and frayed. Partly it was to give my hands something to do when my instincts wanted to act, and my better judgment argued for restraint. The next time something felt off, I told myself I would do better. I kept the camera in my bag like a superstition. I thought having it meant I could at least document, that I could be the kind of person who turned unsettling into evidence. We all like to think we've matured since youth. We like to imagine our bravery improves with age. But you don't buy time with a camera, and you don't absolve a doubt simply by taking a snapshot. A week after Buddy left, I saw him at the edge of the marina in the late afternoon, loading a small cooler into the back of a pickup that looked washed out and borrowed. He didn't look back. He hooked the cooler under his arm and walked like a man who had decided to go home and stay gone. I thought about offering help, about saying something like, "Take care," because social scripts can be a kind of balm. But I didn't. Instead, I watched until he turned a corner and disappeared behind the 2-story bait shack, and the water folded itself into the same indifferent rhythm as before. That's where I stopped before. I wanted to go over and ask questions. I wanted to know whether the muffled voice had been human, consensual, or something else that explanation can't touch. But the marina reminded me that some things answer only in the way they stop answering, by leaving. I made a list of what-ifs that night, and none of them made the guilt any easier. The night I heard the muffled voice, I told myself I'd be more ready. I imagined the 3rd story, something different, something more obviously demanding action. I didn't expect a yacht with an orange distress flag to show up on one of my fishing trips and become the kind of thing I couldn't simply wave away. We were out early before the sky decided what it wanted to be. The sea had a slow grey tone, and the horizon built itself in a way that feels honest. No theatre, just the actual physics of morning. Chris and Dustin and I were on the old skiff, trolling and trading dumb jokes about who could fish the most. It was the kind of unremarkable morning that makes the mind fertile for surprise. When we saw the yacht, it was on the horizon, a silhouette with a stub of orange that didn't belong in the quiet blue. The orange flag caught my eye first. It's formalized equipment. An orange flag is the verbal signal of distress the maritime community agrees upon. It's the same color sailors are told will get attention, even in rough light. Seeing one means someone wants to be seen. The yacht flew one, like someone trying to harness daylight to a problem. We cut the engine, the sound of the skiff folding into the water like hush. The yacht sat like a small island of its own, paint dulled by salt, a few dingy fenders tied to its sides. But what made my stomach do that hollowing thing wasn't the flag itself. It was the way the boat looked used up but not abandoned. There were muddy footprints trailing on the deck, a towel thrown over a rail, the faint steam of 2 mugs placed near a companionway with the kind of immediacy only moments-old heat could produce. The coffee smelled like life. I volunteered to board. It was that simple. The code of the day, the combination of pride and fear that says you go and find out. Chris tightened the lines and tossed me a dock rope, the kind we've thrown 100 times. The ladder was slick under my palm. My camera felt heavier in my bag. Stepping aboard was like stepping into a pause. Everything was placed with the negligence of someone who intends to come back in 5 minutes and never returned. The mugs were warm, the boat's interior smelled faintly of breath, of musk, of salt, and the kind of cleaning solution you buy in a spray bottle. The bed below had been slept in, the sheets wrinkled like a map someone used to find their way. There were no immediate signs of being ransacked or of a struggle. That lack of brutality is often more disorienting than evidence that screams of crime. We are taught to look for the loud obvious and not the small omissions. I went below to look around, flashlight on, camera slung. The hatch gave up a little groan and then the inside of the yacht unfolded. Galley with a plate half crumbled with what looked like toast. A jacket left across a chair like the person planning to return to it within the hour. At the far end of the salon, an older woman sat on the bench like a figure in a photograph that had been pinned and preserved. She was frail in the way that makes your instinct itch. Somebody who had weathered too many winters and decided to stop repairing the exterior. Her eyes were something odd, muted almost, like she had watched too many waves and accepted their rhythms as fact outside of herself. She looked at me and did not move. Her face had a pale, dry look to it, and there was a thinness to her hands that made me think of spent cloth. She didn't speak when I entered, only watched as if she were evaluating a sound under glass. After a moment that lasted too long, she took the orange flag down. It made a small whisper as fabric crossed fabric. She folded it with a kind of care I didn't expect and tucked it away someplace I couldn't see. Then she stood, surprising me with the ease of movement, and walked down into the cabin like she had never moved at all. I asked where she had been, who the boat belonged to, whether she needed help, and she answered in short phrases, those clipped responses people cultivate, when they are either protecting something or protecting themselves from pity. She drank from a mug I did not touch. I remember the steam swirling like a thing that had no idea it was under suspicion. She looked at me once more, eyes like a pale sea glass, and then she was gone, moving to the head of the boat, where a maze of ropes and mess suggested someone had been hurriedly cleaning or averting something. She produced nothing conclusive, the old flag folded and hidden, the cups still warm. I stepped out to call it in to get someone official. Coast Guard, Marina Patrol, something with a badge. I didn't want to leave her alone below deck. I went up the companionway and leaned my shoulder against the frame to steady the phone signal, because of course the one time your reception matters most, it tends to test your resolve. I can still feel the way the boat pitched in that moment, like a person who shifts their entire weight to create a tiny, otherwise unnoticeable change in the world. When I returned with help, a welter of minutes that stretched into not quite enough time, the yacht was gone. Not moved slowly away as an owner pulls up stakes. It had the precise, methodical absence of a thing that had been loosed from the water and vanished into miles of empty morning. The dock where we had left the skiff had no sign of boarding, nothing to say. Yes, someone took the ladder, someone walked down, someone left. Just a streak of wake and a sudden gap in the horizon. I told myself practical things. Maybe they were towed. Maybe they'd left under power and the wake smoothed too quickly. But that didn't explain the warmth of the mugs or the way the woman's hands had been so deliberate when she folded the flag. Those details felt contradictory in a way that refused neat closure. People told me the usual theories. Maybe they had family come get them. Maybe they were embarrassed and left. Friends told me lore, half-jokes about ghost boats and tides, and I listened without committing. I felt ridiculous for being shaken. Boats are things people move for reasons that aren't sinister, but the smell of coffee in an otherwise empty vessel, there are smells that belong to life, and I can spot them. That smell clung to the deck planks in a way that made me certain someone was there not long before I arrived. The three events stacked in my head like a deck of cards in a storm. The island's effigy, Buddy's muffled night voice, the yacht that smelled of coffee and then ceased to exist. Each on its own could be waved away, a prank, an old guy's odor, bad timing. But together they began carving a pattern, small human signatures left in places where beings should have been absent. The water, which we've always treated as a blank slate, had become in my experience a hiding place and a stage. After that morning with the yacht, I started to question, more loudly now, my relationship with silence. I started to hear everything as potential evidence. A twig snapping too precise, a light that winked like an eye, a boot print turned the wrong way. I began taking pictures of things that didn't feel right, cataloguing the ordinary in the hopes that the ordinary would reveal a seam. I began to notice how little we actually know about the other people who share these spaces. Strangers at marinas, the other skippers who tie up at dusk and leave at dawn, those who go out for a day and come back changed. We see their hulls, we note the decals. We observe them like we're reading ships as books, but most of us are not interested enough to read past the cover. I'm not trying to make some grand point about humanity. I'm trying to explain how easy it is to glide past a human moment on the water and file it away as ordinary, because that is safer. It is safety, we tell ourselves, and sometimes it is safety indeed. Other times it is denial. By now you might be thinking I ended up a wreck of paranoia, forever scanning horizons for signs of the uncanny. That's not entirely fair. I still go out, I still laugh, but those nights changed the grammar of my instincts. They introduced friction where there had been a smoothness. I stopped assuming that a quiet night was a safe one. The three stories are not connected by victims or by villains. They're connected by a motif, the uncanny presence of people where they shouldn't be, the way that ordinary objects like coffee mugs or a simple orange flag can scream of humanity in a place where there's supposed to be absence. Each of the three introduced a different version of the same problem. Silence that suggests something else, a small human signature that feels wrong for the place. I won't tell you I have answers. I have questions. I have a camera full of photos that don't prove anything but prove my memory. I have the guilt of what I didn't do sometimes, how I let the perceived danger of investigating alone outweigh the desire to know. I have that tightness in my chest when I see an orange flag now. I have the way my hand keeps the flashlight nearer than it used to be. When you're out on the water at night, everything becomes a story told in fragments. I remember the island's effigy leaning against the tree like a child's bad homework. I remember Buddy's porthole and the way his silhouette nodded like a man who'd already done the math and decided to go. I remember the yacht and its steaming mugs. I remember creeping back to the docks with a camera and a plan and calling people only to find an emptiness that felt deliberate. If you're still with me, I want to tell you the rest. There are details I haven't said, small things I kept for myself, because I was ashamed of them. And there are two arcs here I haven't closed. The story of what, if anything, happened to whoever might have been on Buddy's boat, and the immediate aftermath of the yacht disappearing from the horizon. Those end the night in a way that still echoes forward. They haunt the way I move now, the choices I make when I hear a sound at 3 in the morning. But before I go on, there's something I need to admit. These aren't stories that end neatly. They don't dovetail into a single villain or an obvious explanation. They expand like cracks under weight, and you can either walk around them or peer into them and watch your own courage or cowardice reflected back. I chose both. I fled from the island, and I went back. I ignored noises at marinas, and I watched someone leave with a hardened indifference. I boarded a yacht with a flag in good faith and felt the evidence grow cold while I made a phone call. What I want you to feel as I move on is this. The water is honest in the things it shows and deceitful in the things it swallows. It remembers footprints and effigies and warm mugs. It also hides motion and erases wake so thoroughly that the empty horizon becomes an accusation. So when I tell you the next part, about what happened after we called for help, and when authorities didn't find any trace, about the follow-up and the way friends start to whisper about curses or bad luck, know that I am telling you what I remember, not what I have proven. I am telling you out of obligation to accuracy and because these stories have kept me awake enough nights that I owe them voice. There are a dozen small human decisions that took each night from ordinary to wrong. People who might have needed help, voices muffled in the dark, a signal folded away like a secret. Each of these stuck with me and shaped the way I answer the next unusual sound. I am not trying to scare you for the sake of it. I am trying to impress upon you that the water can be a slippery witness, and that sometimes, when you stand on a dock or shove off toward an island, what you assume about safety is as fragile as a skiff's hull. But there's more you should hear. There are follow-ups I asked for and never fully got. There are nights I spent assembling circumstantial evidence into a case that never found a prosecutor. There are other people too, folks at the marina who started to look at me funny when I asked questions, friends who joked that I had a streak of bad luck, and one or two who suggested it was time to let it go. I didn't let it go that easily. The next mornings and nights after those events are where the real tension began. Not in the immediate frights, but in the slow rewind of choices. The consequence of each small decision is a weight. Every time I thought I did the right thing, some new evidence would arrive to make me doubt whether I had done enough. And that doubt is heavy. A week after the yacht vanished, I started to get calls from people who had seen odd things tied to an orange flag elsewhere. Someone thought they heard a woman's voice on a channel. A local fishing forum lit up with rumors. I followed each thread like a hound. I printed emails. I took more photos. I asked questions of anyone who would speak. Some things turned out to be nothing. Others teased at an outline of a story I still don't have the full shape of. I say all of this because when you live on the water, you learn to trust a rhythm. When that rhythm misses a beat and your hands are the ones that notice, you become a recorder, even when you don't want to be. You collect images and moments like ballast. You keep them in your pocket so the next time you have to decide, you can weigh the moment against evidence. I printed things out, taped photos to my fridge like a conspiracy theorist with a better reason, mugs still warm, the stick man leaning where no one should have left it, a porthole shadow caught in the edge of a grainy photo. I filed emails from strangers who said they'd seen odd flags or heard a voice on a channel at night. Some messages were plausible. Others read like story time at a pier. I followed every line because doing nothing felt worse than following false leads. I went back to the island once more. No fire this time, daylight only. A small group quiet as a church. We walked the perimeter slowly, boots sinking into sand, fingers tracing sea-polished driftwood. There were no footprints leading to the stick figure's tree now, only a faint depression where the effigy must have leaned. The twine was gone. Someone, or the tide, or time, had taken it. We found odd things others had missed. A plastic bead that could have been part of a kid's bracelet, a cigarette butt with a brand none of us smoked, a scrap of fabric that had been fanned into a hollow. Nothing that resolved the night. I came away with more images and less certainty. At the marina, I asked around about Buddy. I asked faces that had begun to register my questions with polite alarm. An older fellow at the bait shack shrugged and said he'd seen Buddy pack up and move on. No drama, no fanfare. Someone else said Buddy's boat had been sold to an indefinido buyer. There was a log at the marina office with his name on the transit slip and a signature that could have been any man's. No one had a story about a missing person. No one had a report to hand me that fit the noise I heard that night. The fact that Buddy simply left, no notes, no police file, made the unanswered sound feel heavier rather than lighter. You want a villain in these things because villains make sense. Silence makes you invent possibilities. I tried the Coast Guard on the yacht. I filed an incomplete report, notes more than evidence, and they told me the usual. We'll look into it. We'll check AIS tracks. We'll see if there were any distress calls. I was naive enough to think that would be the end of it. The response I got back was procedural and careful. They had no record that matched what I described, no active call-outs, and no vessel listed as missing that morning. That didn't comfort me. That meant there was an official emptiness where my memory sat heavy. We never heard back with anything conclusive. The yacht's disappearance remained an absence dressed up with details, mugs, footprints, a folded orange flag, things that argued for human presence and then refused to be cross-examined. Sleep stopped being a refuge. I woke at odd hours because my brain had traded the theater of the day for a night show of possibilities. I'd glance at a light on the water and hold my breath. A gull's cry at 2 a.m. could be someone screaming. A ripple could be a wake made by an engine or else nothing at all. Friends leaned toward a joke about a streak of bad luck. Some suggested letting it go. One or two said I needed to stop looking for patterns where there were only coincidences. I wanted to agree because I wanted to be free of the weight, but the images wouldn't let me. There were small rituals I adopted without meaning to. I stored my camera on the dash and kept it charged. I made sure someone else knew where I was going when I took a boat out after dusk. I learned to say aloud to the people around me, "If I don't come back, check these coordinates." It felt melodramatic until it felt necessary. The water teaches you in strange incremental lessons. That absence is not proof of safety, and that being seen sometimes matters more than being brave. Every once in a while a new detail would arrive. A forum thread would light up, someone in a neighboring town mentioning a flag sighting. A woman would message me that she'd once found a child's effigy by a riverbank and thought it was just kids. Those parallels were small and not evidence of a pattern, but they were rails on which my mind liked to ride. They told me we were not the only ones to notice the edges where normal life frayed into something else. I still struggle with the choices I made. There are nights I play them out like reruns. What if I had shone the flashlight longer? What if I had knocked on Buddy's door and refused to leave until someone spoke? What if I had stayed on the yacht until help arrived? Guilt is a stubborn companion because it converts hypothetical bravery into a ledger of shame. The ledger never balances. And yet, there are brighter, practical outcomes to the months that followed. I talk.